Okay, it looks like people are just coming into our room right now. We'll give it a few seconds. All right. I think we're going to be expecting a few others to be joining us. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today on our webinar entitled The Public Procurement Box. I know what it's like, so there's always folks coming a few minutes behind. So while we're waiting for the rest to join us, what I want to do is maybe share a video of our recent conference with all of you. Hopefully some of you were able to join us for the conference, and you'll see yourselves in the video. And those that weren't able to join us in October, we're really excited to have the national conference hosted in Calgary next year in June. So hopefully you can join us there for the national conference. With that, Jigger, why don't you play the video while we wait for the rest of the folks to arrive to our webinar this today.
Sure. Here we go.
One of the values that I see from a bird construction view, as far as supporting supply chain Canada,
and
is
it's not showing on my
the
screen.
vast array of individuals that we attract and different business units. We have owners, we have constructors, we have a wide array of suppliers, and then also just the ability to attract new and upcoming talent into our industry as well, to help support our industries, but not only that, also the economies as we work on trade and the different logistics and things that come with supply chain, as well as procurement.
Is it playing on yours?
Not only Canada, but into other countries.
Yes, it's on mine. I can see it.
Oh,
Alan, are you able to?
fantastic. Is the video over? I can't see anything on my side. So that's bizarre. That's the first time that has happened to me where I'm on here as a panelist. Obviously, everyone can see. Thank you, Nancy, for letting me know that you can see it as well. But for some reason, I can't see it whatsoever on my side of it. So that's just bizarre. In any case, I think we've got most of the participants that have registered here today. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today on our webinar entitled The Public Procurement Box. So public procurement plays such a pivotal role in Canada's economy. It represents a significant portion of government spending that impacts the standard of living, economic competitiveness, and public service delivery, impacting all of us, right, as citizens of Canada. In 2022, public procurement in Canada accounted for over $200 billion annually, encompassing federal, provincial, and municipal levels. So this vast expenditure touches every single sector, from infrastructure and health to defense and education, all of which impacts all of us. So the ensuring transparency, fairness, and efficient procurement practices is not only critical, but it's critical to also delivering the value for money, and ensuring that we have trust in public institutions as well. So today's webinar is really an introduction to public procurement world, as we explore the application of contract law, trade agreements, government policies, and organizational policies to the public procurement sector. Our webinar presenter today is Paul McDonald. Paul is a partner with AHM and Associates, and leads the supply chain management function for that organization. Paul is a former Canadian Army senior officer. He specialized in logistics planning for many of the domestic and international operations over his 22-year tenure with the Canadian Armed Forces. Additionally to that, Paul has held a number of senior public procurement roles at both Alberta Health Services and the Alberta Gaming Commission as well. I want to invite and thank Paul for being here to present. Participants are reminded that this session is being recorded, and a link to the recording is available to everyone for 30 days. Additionally, in the email that we send out to you with this link, we'll also give you a copy of the presentation for your reference and convenience. So no need to take any screenshots or whatnot. Just focus on Paul and enjoy the webinar presentation. Should you have questions for Paul, I would encourage participants to use the Q&A function in Zoom. And what I'll do is I'll monitor the Q&A function, and hopefully at the end of the webinar, we'll be able to address those questions. For those questions that we can't address at the back end, I'll work with Paul afterwards, and we'll pull that together. So in the email that goes out, we'll also address some of the unanswered questions from the webinar. So again, excited to have you all here. And with that, I'll pass a presentation to Paul to deliver on the public procurement box. Paul.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present on this webinar on behalf of Supply Chain Canada. As Alan was saying, I've spent about 10 years in some senior public procurement roles within Alberta, and during that tenure, it became very clear to me that within public procurement, there really isn't a lot of formal training that goes on to train people the nuances involved with public procurement. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity for anybody working in public procurement. As part of Supply Chain Canada, that Supply Chain Canada offers some specific training for public procurement. Just to give an example, one of the places that I worked, when I first started there, one of my procurement staff, she had been working there for 35 years in procurement. And as I got to know her and talked to her, I asked, what kind of formal training had she had, and she really hadn't had any formal training. So when I asked her some questions on, trade agreements, she knew what the trade agreements were. She didn't really totally understand the implications, let's say, and really through no fault of her own, she was never actually trained or explained why trade agreements are important. So that's just to highlight what I think is there is a need, there is a void in public procurement training, and it's really good to see that Supply Chain Canada's stepping up to offer some courses and some training and to help fill that void. Next slide, Jigger, please. So let's start off with, what is public procurement? Okay, Public procurement is basically is defined as any procurement activity undertaken by a public entity. And so we'll go back and say, so what is exactly is a public entity? Okay, so public entities basically are government ministries and departments at both the provincial and federal levels, crown corporations, and the MASH sector. And so the MASH sector, you'll hear that a lot in public procurement lingo. The MASH sector basically is municipalities, academic institutes, so publicly funded academic institutes, school boards, and then healthcare regions and hospitals. So that's really what makes up the public sector, the public entities. Next slide, please. So some of the things that separate private from public. In the private sector, whose money are they spending? They're spending their own money. And I use the example in my company that I'm a partner in. We can spend the money almost any way we want. It's our money to spend. And private sector tends to be more profit driven. So decisions are made on profit. And as we know, we've been told, if you want to make more profit, you have to take more risk. Okay, so private sector organizations are usually a little bit more, have a little bit more risk tolerance. They're not risk adverse. Public sector, on the other hand, when you ask the question, whose money is it? It's not the organization's money. Okay, the organization's been given that money. It's public money. It's taxpayers' money, and public sector entities are basically service driven. They're there to provide a service. They're not necessarily there to reap profits and to run as a business that earns revenue. There are some in the public sector, but the vast majority, they're service driven. And another aspect of public in the public sector is the stewardship. Those of us that work in public procurement, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to safeguard the funds that have been entrusted to us, and to make sure that money is being spent well, maximizing value for the money, but also being spent properly. And this is where public procurement comes into play. That's our role in the stewardship side, is to make sure that when we do public procurement activities, that we're doing them properly, that we're doing them in accordance with the regulations, the guidelines, the rules, the laws. That's the stewardship part that all of us have as public procurement professionals. Okay. Contract law does apply to both private and public sectors, but the courts in Canada, they tend to hold public sector organizations to a much higher standard than private organizations. So once again, going back to the stewardship topic, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're doing things according to contract law. And then the last part is trade agreements. The trade agreements don't really apply to the private sector, but they play a huge role in the public sector in terms of procurement, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. Next slide, please. So how many of you have been told you need to work outside the box, or you need to find an out-of-the-box solution? How I came up with this idea of the public procurement box was that in one of my roles as a director of procurement, I remember having a conversation with one of the vice presidents, and the vice president, and was expressing their concern over the length of time that it takes to get procurement done, tendering, and so I was explaining how we have to follow the rules, follow contract law, follow the trade agreements, make sure that we're following the established processes. And it was at that time, and I was explaining how by doing that, by placing more rigor on it, it may take a little bit longer. Also, we had to talk about risk. For instance, she had said, well, we need to take some risk. We need to be willing to accept some risk. And I'll go back to the private versus public. In private organizations, the appetite to take risk is much greater. In public organizations tend to be a little bit more risk adverse. So anyway, her comments to me were, well, I think you need to start trying to find some out-of-the-box solution, or you need to start thinking outside of the box. And so I went away, and that that comment about working outside the box really drove home to me. And so I was trying to think of how do I explain to somebody why it's not that easy to work outside of the box in public procurement. And so I came up with the idea of the public procurement box. So if you can, next slide, Jigar.
And the things that you brought up there, Paul, is definitely something that we hear a lot, or I hear a lot from members within the public sector, right? And they do come to me a lot of times because the perception is public procurement, right? You guys are way too slow. It's taking too long. Can't we just, take some shortcuts? And that could get folks into and those organizations into a lot of trouble. And so definitely hear it as well. And interesting for you to go and share some of the 4 boxes of that public procurement model.
Yeah, and just to your point there, Alan, I remember one day we had an RFP that closed, and an organization submitted their RFP late. It was like an hour late. And so, of course, we didn't accept it because it was beyond the RFP closing time. The president of the company, one of the vice presidents, went to the president of the company and said, this is crazy. We could save $100,000. The proposal that came in late is $100,000 less. We're happy with them. We should go with them. And so the president came to see me and say, why don't we just do it? And so I explained to him why we couldn't, why it was against contract law. And I remember this, he said to me, I talked to my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law owns a construction company. And he said he would never leave $100,000 on the table, that he would take that risk, and that he would
absolutely,
he would definitely roll the dice and take the risk. And I said, yeah, but that's his money. He's willing to accept that reputational risk. We as stewards for the government and for the public, we really can't take that risk. So he reluctantly agreed with me. And so not too long after that, I organized for a contract law lawyer to come in and do a presentation, do a half-day training session with the executive team. So the senior leadership, so all the vice presidents, as well as all the directors in the organization. And I remember at one of the coffee breaks, the president went up to the lawyer and he explained the situation where Paul didn't allow this company to bid, and I'm having a hard time with. And luckily for me, that contracting lawyer said, "Oh my God, it's a good thing you didn't accept it. Paul is 100% correct, and the risk you would have had and the consequences." And so it was very good to hear that from a third party. But that is the general consensus out there, and it's not that these people that challenge public procurement and what we do as public procurement professionals, it's not that they're bad people or that they're trying to scam the system or cut corners to get around. They simply don't know. Okay, there's a lot of moving pieces to public procurement, and we'll go a little bit through them here in the box in a few minutes. But there's a lot of moving pieces, and not a lot of people know about it. So those of us that work in public procurement, we do know. Some of us know a lot. Some of us know a little bit, and that's the purpose of this presentation. I think is going to be to say, where are our risk areas? What are the challenges within public procurement? So, hence, I came up with the concept of the public procurement box. Okay, so we have a simple box, right? 4 walls on the box, and the 4 walls that confine us into public procurement are contract law, trade agreements, government policies, and organizational policies. These are what creates the box for us. So when somebody says you need to think outside of the box, if you consider it, you're considering acting outside of contract law or outside of trade agreements or the policies. And so I really like this concept of the procurement box because it gives you a visual of where we're working and what confines us to working in public procurement. Next slide, please. So the first one is contract law. Okay, and next slide again, Jigger, please. So contract law. So within, okay, right. So within Canada, contract law is based on Canadian case law. And so I actually teach competitive bidding and contract law at a college here at Edmonton. And so when we start off and talking about contract law, we first have to talk about, is it how case law works in Canada? Because I remember being at one of the Crown corporations I worked at, and I remember telling it was either a vice president or a director, I said, we can't do that. It's against the law. It's against contract law. And he asked me, he said, show me the law, right? Show me where it says you can't do that. And I said, well, it's not quite that simple. In Canada, you have the Criminal Code of Canada, and so there's multiple volumes of that, and you can pull volume 22 off of the shelf and look it up, and it'll say, murder. If you commit murder, you are, that's against the law, and you are subject to the range of the following punishments. There's no really one document that does that for contract law in Canada. It's based on case law, and so how case law works in Canada is, and I'll specifically with regards to contracting and procurement. If an entity, if a vendor or an issuing agency, if they think they've been done wrong or something was done illegally or against the law, or just basically, I don't think that's fair. I don't think what happened was fair. They have the opportunity to take you to court, to sue you. And that's basically how case law works. So two organizations will come in. One will say, I don't think this was fair. I think I was wrong. And I think as a result of that, I lost money. And so the court will ask both sides to present their case. The court will weigh the evidence, hear what was said, and they'll come back with a finding. And that finding will either be, yes, we agree with the complainant, or no, we don't. And if they do, if they say, yes, we agree with the complainant, you were wronged, and here's the resolution, here's the result. And so how case law works is, once that is done, that now sets a precedent. And so for going forward, all future cases, and in this case, we're talking contract and contract law and procurement, future cases must abide by that. And so when we talk contract law is 30 plus years of cumulative cases going before the courts and findings being found. So when we talk about contract law, that's what contract law is. So there's no one book we can go find things, but there are a number of cases, hundreds of cases. Okay, the findings from those cases drive the competitive bidding process. Okay, so for instance, using the example I used before, in the past, somebody was awarded a contract. A non-successful proponent found out that proposal was accepted after the deadline, and they said, we don't think that's fair. So they went to court. The courts heard both sides, and the court says, no, you're right. You said in your bidding document that it would close at 2 p.m. on this date. You accepted a bid at 3 o'clock on the closing time. You should not have accepted it. You should not have reviewed it. You should not have evaluated it. And based on our opinion, the complainant, if they would have won the competition, and so therefore we're going to award them $1 million in lost profits or whatever it was. Okay, so that's how case law works in Canada. Now, getting back to contract law, the landmark case in Canada is considered Ron Engineering versus the province of Ontario. So this is a case where Ron Engineering tried to back out of a bid that they had put in on a competition. If you can go back up, Jigger, thanks. Yeah, please, thank you. So Ron Engineering, they tried to back out of a bid after the closing, after they'd been awarded the work. And the provincial government said, you know what, I don't think you can do that. And so they took it to court. And so it went through a number of court challenges. It went through a local court, then it went through an appeals court, then it went to the provincial appeals, then it ended up going all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. And it's significant because it's the first procurement contracting case that went before the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of Canada. Okay, Supreme Court of Canada looked at that and they came back and they said, no, the province is right. The province put out a tender, and in that tender, by doing so, they said, we are saying we will award to a successful proponent. Proponents, when they bid, you are basically saying, if we are awarded the work, we will do it. And so the province, the Supreme Court said, in essence, there's two contracts here. There's contract A and contract B. And contract B is the actual contract that gets signed. And so, as you know, in an RFP, when you put out an RFP, you have to put in an example of the contract that you're going to sign, a copy of it. And they said, that's actually contract B. And they said, the court said, we think a contract was actually entered into by the provincial government saying we will award work at the end of this process, and by companies saying we will do that work if we're the winner. And then the Supreme Court said, that's a contract. That's a binding verbal contract. So contract A. So the significance of this landmark case, Ron Engineering versus Province of Ontario, is that two things. One is that it brought contract law and procurement law to the forefront, to the highest courts in the land, which was pretty significant at the time. And then it also started setting out the basis of fair and legal contract bidding in Canada. Okay, so getting back to contract law in general, it covers both the contracts and competitive bidding. Okay, contract law is there to protect the integrity of the bidding process, the competitive bidding process. You will see if you study and if you go through a number of the key cases, and almost all those cases, the presiding judge in their finding, they will use the words like to protect the integrity of the competitive bidding process, or to protect the element of fairness. Okay, so contract law is based on the principle of fairness. What is fair? Okay, the case decisions from these contract law cases, they drive the development and the updating of the competitive bidding process. And so the competitive bidding process, which we can talk about later, and it's for follow-on training, but the competitive bidding process is the rigid standard process that incorporates the years and years and years of contracting law cases, the findings from contracting law cases. And basically, if you follow the proper competitive bidding process, you'll be doing that process. You'll be doing your competitive bidding in a fair, open, and transparent manner, hopefully. But you'll also be following the laws, and more importantly, you're reducing the risk that you're going to be taken to court, to have litigation against you. Next slide, please, Jigger. Okay, so why is contract law important? Well, contract law is important because the results of the findings from the decades of contract law have developed and drives the process. Okay, and so it tells us what we can and cannot do. For instance, to go back to my original example, contract law said, if you state a closing time, you must not accept any proposals after that closing time. So that one particular case, what that meant was, going forward, the acceptable competitive bidding process is that when you state a closing time, you must adhere to it, and you must not accept. You have the obligation not to accept and not to evaluate any proposals that are late. So that sets the precedent for going forward. So the question I would get asked by my fellow directors and by vice presidents would be, okay, so what? So what happens if we decide to break the law? Well, my first comment back to them will be, well, I think we now have an ethical issue. Okay, that if I'm telling you you're breaking the law and you're saying you want to do it anyway, that's calling into question our ethics, that we're doing something that we know is wrong.
That's a big issue.
It's a big issue, and surprisingly, when I would challenge a vice president and say, oh, well, we're now onto an ethical issue, and they would look at me and say, well, we're not doing anything unethical here. And I said, well, ethics is basically doing the right thing even with nobody watching, and you're asking to do the wrong thing knowing that it's wrong. But to get to what really hits organizations in the pants or in their pocketbook is, what are the implications? Well, first off, you can be found that you have to pay another vendor. So an example would be Terracon versus British Columbia. Now, this is a case where the province of British Columbia, put out a tender to build a bridge, and they put some specifications in the bridge. They awarded not to Terracon, but to another engineering company. And what ended up happening was the engineering company, during the negotiations, after they had been awarded, said, this bridge would be better and cheaper if you built it using steel instead of concrete. And the province, oh, okay, that's great. We'll go ahead and do it. When Terracon found out, they said, well, wait a minute. That's not what you asked for in the tender documents. And so they said, we think we've been wrong. So they took the province to court. And the courts in British Columbia said, you know what? No, Terracon is right. If you ask for something in a tendering document, you can't then decide to award for something else. Okay. That case, going forward, set the precedent and the law that you can't ask for something, you can't accept something that you haven't asked for in the tendering documents. So what was the result? Terracon was awarded $1 million in lost profits. So the province of British Columbia would have paid $10 or $15 million probably to have this bridge built, but then they also had to pay $1 million to a vendor that didn't win it. So there's the monetary fines, the award. There can also be fines on top of the awards, the punitive, the penalty, or not the penalties, the award to the company. If the courts find that you blatantly, egregiously ignored contract law, you could be given a fine. So in a case of like Terracon versus British Columbia, I don't think they were found to be egregious. But if they had been, it's possible that the courts could have said, we find that you need to award Terracon $1 million, and we're going to fine you $500,000 for your complete disregard for contract law. So what happens if you don't follow contract law? You can go to court, and if you're found in the wrong, it can cost you money. The second thing that it can cost you is your reputational risk. Okay, as a public entity who's, and we'll go back to that first slide where we're saying, within public procurement and public entities, we have to safeguard public funds. And so that's not a good look for an organization to be found to be violating Canadian law. Okay, so there's a risk to your reputation. The second part about reputational risk is within the vendor community. For all of our businesses, the vendor communities are actually pretty small. And so you run the risk, if you don't follow contract law, and if you're found guilty or found to have violated contract law, you run the risk that vendors within your vendor group may not want to bid on work that you have downstream because you're viewed as being not a reputable organization. So all that to say, what's the so what of contract law if you don't follow it? So what? Why is it important? It's important because it can cost you money, and probably more importantly, it can really affect your organization's reputation. Okay, next slide, please. So we covered contract law. The next one is trade agreements. So contract law and trade agreements are truly the two main drivers of public procurement and competitive bidding process. So we'll go to the next, next slide, please. So, sorry, just. So what are the trade agreements? So the trade agreements are agreements between government entities. They can be international or they can be internal, so they can be national. So these trade agreements at the highest level, in the big picture, trade agreements are agreements between two government entities. So let's, as an example, say Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So there's a United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And that trade agreement, basically, it lays out a whole bunch of things. But the snapshot is, those trade agreements say, all three of these countries, we agree to do free trade between each other. We're not going to assign tariffs and duties, right? We're going to make trade a lot easier between our three nations. Now, That's the main reason for the trade agreements, but the trade agreements also have a procurement portion to them. And those procurement portions basically say that we agree to open the doors for procurement between the various signatory agencies of the agreement. So in the case of the USMCA, Canada, the US, and Mexico have said people from all of our countries can bid on any government work for any of the 3 countries. Okay, so that's what sets it out. And the most important part of trade agreements in terms of public procurement are the thresholds. Okay, and so trade agreements set thresholds for the threshold dollar value of a procurement where you're obligated to go to public tendering. Okay, so you can open that one up for me, please, Jigger, the thresholds. And so this is a page from the Government of Canada, and it basically lays out, it summarizes all the trade agreements that Canada has entered into, and the main trade agreements that Canada has entered into. And we'll focus in on the Canadian Free Trade Agreement just as an example. So the Canadian Free Trade Agreement is an internal trade agreement signed by all the provinces and territories within Canada, which basically says that we agreed to free trade of goods and services within between the provinces and territories. It also talks about trade mobility, right? That tradesmen can go from Nova Scotia to Ontario to British Columbia. There's no restrictions. And then from a procurement point of view, what the Canadian Free Trade Agreement says is that there's no barriers. We want to reduce the barriers for doing procurement within Canada. And so with that, they set some thresholds. Okay. And so, and actually, before we get to the thresholds, we'll say the trade agreement, when it comes to thresholds, it breaks government entities into 2 categories: entities and then crown corporations and other government enterprises. And they have 2 different thresholds for those 2 different groups of government organizations. So within entities, you have ministries and departments, okay? And the threshold for them for goods is $33,400. So what that means is any purchase of goods over 30, oh, if you can just go back to that slide a bit, Jigger, if you could. Yeah, sorry. So it says the purchase of any goods over $33,400 must be tendered competitively, publicly and competitively, and must be open to anybody within Canada. Okay. It also says that for services, the threshold is $133,800, and the same for construction. So any acquisition of services or construction over $133,000 must be tendered publicly. Now, if we flip over to the right and look at crown corporations and other government entities, and those other government entities is basically the MASH sector that we spoke about a little bit earlier. You can see that there's a much higher threshold for crown corporations and other government entities. So according to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, it's $668,000 for goods and services. Okay, so that's what thresholds do. And so when we as public procurement professionals, when we talk about trade agreements, probably the number one thing that concerns us is these thresholds, because it dictates when we have to do competitive bidding. Okay. If we can go back to the main slide, Jacob, please. So the other important part about trade agreements is that the requirements of the trade agreement, it drives part of the bidding process. For instance, because government procurement is open to anybody in Canada, that means that in our bidding documents, we cannot say that preference will be given to local vendors. Because if I'm looking to buy a fleet of pickup trucks, let's say for a municipality, I can't say that preference will be given to local vendors, because that means that vendors from British Columbia, from Nova Scotia, from Ontario, would not be accepted. And that goes against the trade agreement, because the trade agreement says we're going to do free trade and free and bidding that's open to everybody. Okay, so that's the 2 main the two main reasons why trade agreements are important are thresholds and the impact it has on competitive bidding process. The basic procurement principles that guide trade agreements are that procurement must be open. So that means open to anybody that's a signee of the trade agreement. It must be fair. So by must be fair, it means you must follow a fair process. Okay. And then it also must be transparent. And what transparent it means is that that process, you have to say what that process is. It means you can't ask for a proposal and then not say how you're going to score it. You have to be open and transparent with how you're doing your public procurement. Okay. Trade agreement updates. The trade agreements are generally updated every 2 years, January 1st of every 2 years. The last update was made on January 1st, 2024. The next update will be on January 1st, 2026. So that means that the previous slide that we had that showed the thresholds, those thresholds will be valid up until January 1st, 2026. Then in January 2026, they may change, they may not change. But what you need to know is that there is a shelf life. So there is a shelf life on the thresholds and the trade agreements, and that is that they're updated every second year. So for us operating in Alberta and British Columbia, the most applicable trade agreements for us are the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Okay, it covers all the provincial and territories. There's also one called the New West Partners Trade Agreement. And this New West Partners Trade Agreement is between British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And so it's a separate trade agreement. And Jigger, can you open that one up, please? So on this one here, you can see the thresholds are much lower. So if you remember back to the CETA agreement, the threshold for Crown corporations was $680,000. The threshold for provincial Crown corporations under the New West Partners Trade Agreement is $25,000 for goods, $100,000 for services. So you see these limits are much lower than the CETA agreement. And what this means is, as public procurement professionals, when we taking into account the trade agreements, we have to take into account the lowest threshold. So it's not, we can't turn around and say, well, according to CETA, it's 600, so we're good. We have to go to all the trade agreements that we are signees to and use the lowest thresholds as the thresholds for consideration in our public tendering. If you go back, Jigger, please. Okay, and the next slide. So the third wall is government policies. If you go to the next slide again, Jigger, please. So some of the main government policies that apply to us are the Financial Administration Act, which basically lays out how government money can be gathered and how government money can be spent. So for us on the public procurement side, we're really focused on how can we spend the money. So the Financial Administration Act lays out a lot of the guidelines on how public funds can be expended, okay, and the process for doing that. There's federal and provincial contracting policies, okay, and then there's some provinces that have some additional guidelines for contracting. For instance, in Alberta has what they call the Alberta Procurement Accountability Framework, and this came in about 10 or 15 years ago. And it said, you know, the government of Alberta said government entities within Alberta are going to be held to a very high standard for public procurement, how they spend public funds. And so some of the examples of the Alberta Public Procurement Accountability Framework is that there's a $10,000 limit. So this accountability framework says any goods being acquired, goods or services, over $10,000 must be competed competitively. So it's very restrictive, and it makes our job as public procurement professionals very challenging if we're working within an Alberta provincial setting. Some of the other points of this Alberta Procurement Accountability Framework, it basically dictates that every public entity must create a procurement review committee. And what that does is that committee is supposed to see all contracts before they're signed, and they do a review to make sure that they were tendered properly, that they've been evaluated properly, and that they're awarded properly. It's just another step of compliance checking within the government. And then the third component that's important to us is that there's a reporting component. And so this accountability framework says that all government entities must, I believe it's monthly or quarterly, report all contracts that they've entered into. So if you can see, if you go back, all these policies and guidelines, there's a lot to navigate for us public procurement professionals. And so it also highlights the need for additional training so that we become familiar with them and that we know what they are. And then there's other governmental policies and guidelines that may be applicable to your respective organization.
Paul, just as a quick time check, we've got 15 minutes left in the webinar.
Yeah, and I think I got like 2 slides left, 2 or 3 slides left. So we should be good. Okay. Next slide, Jigger, please. So the last one is your own specific organizational policies. And next slide again, Jigger, please. Okay, so organizational policies. These are the policies that define how our particular public organization will conduct our internal business. And for the sake of this presentation, let's say how we conduct procurement. Okay. Why is this important, the organizational policies? Because it helps us to ensure compliance, and it helps us to manage and mitigate risks associated with public procurement. The consequences, by not having good organizational policies, or by not following our own internal organizational policies, we may expose our organization to the risk of litigation, financial, and reputational risk. So some of the examples of internal organizational policies are some financial policies, the delegation of authority policy, which is really important for us public procurement people, because it tells us who within the organization is allowed to commit organizational money for procurement and to what level. Okay, so that's very important for us to know. Another example would be procurement cards, often found as a financial policy, not a procurement policy, but it dictates who can have procurement cards and how to use them. Sustainable procurement and contracting. That's an example of a growing field. So most organizations now are really concerned with sustainability, both environmental sustainability and social sustainability. So I've seen in the last 8 to 10 years, I've seen a big change in how public organizations view sustainability. It used to be, 10 to 15 years ago, that a lot of organizations didn't put a lot of effort into being sustainable. It really wasn't high on our radar. It's very high on our radar now. And so most organizations should have a sustainable procurement policy for contracting. Another one would be a sole source policy. So this sole source policy would tell you how and when you can do sole sourcing if it's allowed. And it should also give you a lot of the exceptions to allow you to sole source contracting, and then give examples of those. And then the last one would be a code of conduct. Most organizations have a code of conduct that dictates how representatives of that organization must conduct themselves. So here's some examples of some of the organizational policies that may exist. So next slide. So brings us back to the procurement box and the 4 walls. And so I'll go back to that first question. And have you ever been asked to think outside the box or to find an outside the box solution? So you can see now that if you really want to operate outside this box, you're going to break one of the 4 walls. You're going to break contract law, or you're going to break trade agreements, you're going to break government policies, or you're going to break your own organizational policies. Based on this, I don't think we have, within public procurement, we don't have a lot of wiggle room or room to actually work outside of this box. The best we can hope to do is maybe stretch some of the box, stretch some of these walls. And by stretching, I mean, we may be able to move the yardsticks a bit on organizational policies. Organizational policies is probably the only one, because our organizational policies should be either in line with contract law, government policies, trade agreements, or create an even higher standard. And so when I say you can stretch your organizational policy rules, you can stretch them, but only to the point that you're not breaking one of the other three walls. So for instance, at AGLC, I put a policy in place that said, for acquisition of goods between $10,000 and $65,000, you have to get 3 quotes. Okay, and at the time, that was lower than the trade agreements, and that was lower than government policies. So we weren't breaking those laws. The trade agreement said you had to go to public tendering for anything over $65,000. So by our organization setting up a policy that says you have to get 3 quotes up to $65,000, when I say we can stretch that, that's our own internal organization. And you may have a little bit of wiggle room to say, you know what, in this one particular case, it makes sense to sole source. It's still under the $65,000, which the trade agreements at the time was the threshold. So you can still do it. So to go back to that original statement, to think and work out and find out of the box solutions, it's tough to do. And I would say that maybe we don't find an out of the box solution, but we might be able to stretch some a bit without breaking any of the 4 walls. Next slide, please. So, and the next one too, please. So what are some of the impacts of poor practices? If you don't have good public procurement practices, poor sourcing, tendering, and contracting results, you may not get what you want. It may take longer than necessary contracting timelines. To go back to what Alan said, the number one complaint he probably hears about public procurement, how long it takes to get something done. And then probably the biggest impact of poor public procurement practices is risk. Risk of litigation, risk of trade agreement challenges, and then risk to both your personal and organizational reputation. And the next slide, and I promise you, Alan, this is my last slide. So a good, strong public procurement organizations have the following. They have people who are well-trained procurement staff. They have ongoing training for their procurement staffs, and they have organizational education. Now, I tell my students when I teach public procurement, we have an obligation to help educate our own organization. So when that vice president comes to me or comes to you and says, hey, can we think outside the box? Why don't we accept that bid that's 10 minutes late? It's an opportunity for us to educate others in the organization on the trade agreements and contract law and why we do things the way we do it in public procurement. Okay. Another thing that strong public procurement organizations have are strong policies, good, strong policies that can be enforced. They have established processes. So policies set the overarching guidelines on how to do something. Processes tell us the detailed how we're supposed to do things. So for instance, there should be a process on sole source acquisitions or sole source purchases. And it dictates very specifically how we can do that. Good, strong public procurement organizations have templates for RFPs, for contracts, for getting quotes, using templates that are the same all the time. And we also have checklists. Good, strong public procurement organizations use checklists in everything they do to make sure that they're following the 4 walls of the procurement box, to make sure that they're not breaking one of those walls or acting outside of it. And then good, strong public procurement organizations also use systems to help them in their procurement. ERP systems, e-bidding systems, contract management systems. These are all systems that can really help a public procurement organization do their job better. And by do their job better, I mean do it with a high level of compliance, but also with a high level of satisfaction for our internal customers, getting them what they need. And I think that's it, Alan, for me, and the rest is over to you.
Maybe we'll go to the next slide here, and so thank you so much for the presentation, Paul. Jigar, the previous one, please. And you know, the session today was really that introduction to public procurement, right? And I, like I said at the intro, I do hear from a lot of folks around experiences, around, I've been asked to consider things outside the box. What do I do? So even understanding what are the constraints, and then how do you best communicate those constraints to others within the organization, right? And it's not, as you said, Paul, I think it's not because people are purposely circumventing and they're finding ways to do it in a malicious way. Is most of the time it's people not understanding. And so how do we equip our procurement professionals with the knowledge necessary for them to communicate these constraints and the reasons, the rationale why we have those constraints in place? I recognize as you delve deeper into some of this, the logic of why those things are in place have been lost just due to time, and I think some of those trade agreements may require some refreshing and whatnot. But generally, above, at a high level, how do you, there's an intention of how do you protect public interest? How do you protect, all of these arrangements and agreements that you have in place, and communicating that is really, really key. We will have some further training that will delve into the details of all of this, whether it's contract law, trade agreement, or the public competitive bidding process later on in the year. So we're going to be able to dive deeper into all of this, and I'd encourage all of you to look out for those PD workshops that are available, and we'll go into a half day or a full day into each of those topics. There are some questions in the Q&A, Paul, and I think we should be able to get through one of them, and then the other one from Nancy we'll go after. We'll send a response afterwards. So the one came from Saiju, was relating to the example that you used at the beginning around, and so the question is, so how did the president know that it is $100,000 less? Late tenders are not opened and returned back to the vendor. So this was more of a comment. Nancy jumped in and said, hey, standard instructions related to delayed bids can be found in the supply manual, sections 4.85.5 delayed bids, which then actually points you to the construction provisions within the supply manual. Did you want to maybe comment on that briefly, Paul?
Yeah, on Sanju's point, yeah, I think that the bids came in, and this was early in my tenure at AGLC, and over the next 5 years, I put into place more processes around it, more structure around it. So when I first arrived at AGLC, their procurement policy was 15 years old. It said nothing about sole sourcing. They didn't have a process for opening and closing RFPs. They didn't have a lot of standardized process templates and stuff. And so over the first 2 or 3 years that I worked there, it was transforming how we did procurement. While I was there, I completely changed how we did procurement. For instance, I think I had, at the time when I first joined, I think I had 3 senior buyers who were responsible for all the RFPs. And how they were assigned was, next one goes to A, next one goes to B, next one goes to C, and then back to A, back to B, back to C. And one of the biggest complaints I had from the organization, from the vice presidents, was that procurement doesn't understand our business. And I said, you're right, we don't. And so one of the first things I did was I assigned functional business areas to specific senior buyers. So David, you're now going to be doing IT. And David, who worked for me, said, I don't know a lot about IT contracting. And I said, well, guess what? In about a year or two, you'll be the subject matter expert, because you'll learn a lot about it. And so I changed the way we did procurement, instituted new policies. So to answer your question, Sanju, yes, when I found out that they had accepted a late bid, I'm like, no, late bids don't get opened. Just as you had said, Sanju, we don't open the late bids, they get put aside. We'll see if there's any extenuating circumstances and things like that. So it's evolved. I think every public procurement organization in Canada is constantly evolving, and you have to be. Trade agreements change, case law changes all the time. And so what we did for the last 10 years, which was good, may not be good going forward. So we got to be constantly looking to, do we need to change our competitive bidding processes because of changes to trade agreements or changes to contract law? And it's that ongoing training piece that's really important for strong public procurement organizations.
Super. And with that, Paul, we are at the top of the hour. I want to make sure that we close and finish on time. So I want to thank all of our participants for joining us this afternoon on the webinar. Just a reminder, we will send out a link to the recording as well as the presentation. We have a number of questions from various folks that were unanswered, and we'll work to provide a response in an email out to all of you. Paul, thank you so much for your insights and in sharing your knowledge. And thank you everyone for being a part of our webinar today. And we hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Everyone. Super. Jigger, can we end the recording, and then can you make sure that we grab all of the questions that are posted in the Q&A and have that over to Paul, and then Paul can help us draft the responses that we can then share with everyone as well. And the questions seem to be in both the Q&A, but also in the comment section as well. So let's make sure we grab all of those.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so why don't we end this session now, guys? And Jigger, why don't we set up a quick debrief call with Paul right after this?
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, sure. We are all set.
Okay, super. So let's jump into the other call. We can close this down now.
Okay.
Thanks.